Chapter 3. Secrets. Sir John soon had more visitors at Barton Park. He had recently met two young ladies with the family name Steele, who were his distant cousins. He had invited them to visit, and they had accepted immediately. The Dashwood sisters came to Barton Park to meet Sir John's new guests. They found the Steele sisters polite and elegant. The elder sister Anne looked very plain, but the younger sister Lucy was a beautiful 23-year-old lady.
"Miss Dashwood," asked the elder Miss Steele, "do you like Devonshire? You must have been sorry to leave beautiful Norland."
Eleanor was surprised that the Steeles knew about her family. "Yes, Norland is a lovely place."
"You must have had many handsome bachelors there," added Anne.
"Good heavens, Anne,"
cried Lucy.
"all you think and talk about is men."
Eleanor was glad when their meeting was finished. She found the elder Steele sisters' conversation too vulgar, and the younger sister Lucy too clever for her taste. The Steeles thought differently, and soon the young ladies were together for an hour or two every day. Sir John told the Steeles everything about the Dashwoods' lives. One day, Anne Steele congratulated Eleanor on Marianne's engagement to a very fine young man. Then the Steeles told Eleanor that Sir John talked about her suspected attachment to Edward.
"Mr. Ferrars," said Anne Steele, "your sister-in-law's brother? He's a very pleasant young man. We know him well."
"How can you say that, Anne?"
cried Lucy, who always corrected everything her sister said.
"We've only seen him once or twice at my uncle's house."
Eleanor was shocked. She wanted to know who their uncle was and how they knew Edward, but she didn't ask questions. During the next few days, Lucy took every chance to make conversation with Eleanor. She was clever and humorous, but Eleanor pitied her for lacking education and disliked the insincerity, dishonesty, and self-interest that lay behind her words and actions. While Eleanor and Lucy were walking alone, Lucy asked,
"You may think this question strange, but do you know your sister-in-law's mother, Mrs. Ferrars?"
The question was strange to Eleanor. "I've never met her," she answered coldly.
"Then you couldn't say what kind of woman she is?"
questioned Lucy. "No," Eleanor plainly replied, holding back her true opinion of Edward's mother. "I don't know anything about her." Then Lucy looked at Eleanor.
"I wish I could tell you about the difficult situation I'm in."
"Well, I wish I could help you, but I don't know Mrs. Ferrars."
"Mrs. Ferrars knows nothing of me,"
Lucy said with a shy, sidelong glance at Eleanor.
"but we will be closely connected soon."
"Good Lord," cried Eleanor. "Do you mean with Mr. Robert Ferrars?"
She didn't like the idea of Lucy becoming her sister-in-law.
"No,"
replied Lucy.
"not Robert. I've never met him in my life. I mean his elder brother, Edward."
Eleanor was silent with shock.
"You must be surprised,"
said Lucy.
"because he never mentioned our relationship to your family. I know Edward won't be angry that I've told you our secret. He trusts you so much and looks upon you and your family almost as sisters."
Eleanor forced herself to remain calm. "May I ask how long you have been engaged?"
"We've been engaged for 4 years now,"
she answered. Eleanor couldn't believe it.
"We met here in Devonshire while Edward was studying law,"
said Lucy.
"I didn't want to get engaged without his mother's approval, but I was young and loved him so much. Oh, dear Edward, look, I carry his picture everywhere."
She pulled a small painting of Edward from her pocket and showed it to Eleanor. Her heart sank.
"You can't imagine my suffering,"
continued Lucy.
"We see each other so infrequently."
She put her hand to her eyes. Eleanor was unsympathetic.
Sometimes I think about breaking it off,
continued Lucy.
but I couldn't bear hurting him. What do you think?
You must decide for yourself, answered Eleanor.
Poor Edward doesn't even have my picture,
Lucy went on.
but I sent him a ring with a lock of my hair in it. Did you see him wearing it when he visited you recently?
I did, Eleanor answered. Her calm voice concealed her great unhappiness. She was shocked, confused, and miserable. Their conversation ended, and Eleanor was sure Edward still cared for her. She felt he loved her and would never have intentionally deceived her. He was trapped by a beautiful yet insincere, vulgar, selfish girl. Her interest lay in his future income. Eleanor was very careful to hide her unhappiness. She knew if she told her family the bad news about Edward, their misery would only add to her own. On several occasions, she spoke quietly with Lucy about the situation. Eleanor learned that Lucy planned to hold Edward to the engagement. She was jealous that Edward held Eleanor in such high esteem. Why else would Lucy tell Eleanor her secret, but to warn her to keep away from Edward? What made Eleanor most sad was that she knew Edward did not love his future wife. He had no chance of having a happy marriage. Mrs. Jennings, who was making plans to return to her London house, surprised Eleanor and Marianne with an invitation.
You must come along,
she told the Dashwood sisters.
I'm so good at finding husbands for single girls. If I can't get at least one of you married, it won't be my fault.
Eleanor wanted to refuse. She feared she might run into Edward and Lucy Steele in London. But Marianne was excited at the chance of seeing Willoughby, who was still in London. Mrs. Dashwood insisted that they accept the invitation. When Eleanor and Marianne got to their room in Mrs. Jennings' luxurious house in London, both girls took out their pens and paper for letter writing. I'm writing home to Mother, said Eleanor to Marianne. Perhaps you should hold off a few days.
I'm not writing to Mother,
replied Marianne. Eleanor realized her sister was writing to Willoughby. Marianne was nervous for the rest of the evening. She could eat almost nothing and anxiously listened to the sound of every passing carriage. After dinner, there was a knock on the door. Marianne jumped up and cried,
It must be Willoughby!
She ran toward the door and almost threw herself into the arms of Colonel Brandon. Her shock was too great to bear with calmness. She left the room, and Eleanor greeted the Colonel. Eleanor was sorry to see the man so in love with her sister. He experienced only her bitter disappointment when she saw him. The Colonel asked,
Is she ill?
Eleanor made several excuses about tiredness and headaches. Mrs. Jennings entered the room cheerfully and asked the Colonel where he had been. The Colonel replied politely, but gave no definitive answer. He soon left, and all of the ladies went to bed early. The next day found Marianne cheerfully hoping to see Willoughby. She was terribly distracted all day. When the ladies returned from shopping, there was still no answer from Willoughby. After being at Mrs. Jennings' house for a week, Marianne finally saw Willoughby's card on the table when they came home from a ride.
He's been here while we were out,
exclaimed Marianne. From then on, she stayed at home while the others went out. When a letter came the next day, Marianne tried to grab it, but it was for Mrs. Jennings. Were you expecting a letter? Asked Eleanor, who could see her sister's disappointment.
Just a little,
sighed Marianne. Dear sister, don't you trust me? Asked Eleanor.
How can you, who trusts in no one, ask me that?
Replied Marianne. I have nothing to tell, Eleanor blustered, wanting to reveal the secret of Lucy Steele's engagement to Edward.
Nor do I,
replied Marianne.
You communicate nothing, and I hide nothing.
One night, the two Dashwood sisters went to a party with Lady Middleton. Willoughby was there, standing with an elegant young lady. Marianne was delighted when she saw him. She began to run to him, but Eleanor stopped her.
"Be calm," said Eleanor. "Hide your feelings."
It was impossible for Marianne. She sat with anxiety and impatience written on her face.
Why won't he look at me?
Cried Marianne. Finally, Willoughby turned around and looked at them. Marianne jumped up and held her hand out to him. He came over and spoke to Eleanor, not Marianne, asking about their mother's health. Marianne blushed and cried,
Willoughby, why didn't you visit me?
I visited,
he said.
but you weren't home.
Haven't you received my letters?
She said with wild anxiety.
There must have been some terrible mistake. I beg you to tell me, what's the matter?
Willoughby looked ashamed, glancing over at the young lady he had been standing next to earlier.
Yes, I received the information that you were in town. Thank you for it.
With that, he turned away to join a friend. Marianne was pale and unable to stand. Eleanor helped her into a chair. Willoughby left the party soon after. Riding home, Eleanor realized that Marianne's attachment with Willoughby was over. She felt bitter over his tasteless manner of ending it. That night, Eleanor was kept awake by the sound of Marianne's sobbing. The next day, a letter arrived for Marianne. Mrs. Jennings asked if it was a love letter.
I've never seen a woman so in love in my life. I hope he won't keep her waiting.
When Eleanor went into their room, Marianne was sobbing violently. Eleanor held her hand and burst into tears too. Then she read his letter.
Dear Madam, I beg your forgiveness if you didn't approve of my behavior last night. I will always remember our visits with great fondness. I hope I didn't give you the impression that I felt more for you than I ever expressed. Please, understand that I've been engaged to someone else for a long time. We will be married soon. With this letter, I am returning the lock of your hair that you so kindly offered me. Your friend, John Willoughby.
Eleanor was disgusted with the cold, official manner of this letter. It was hurtful and cruel. In an instant, she was glad that Marianne would not wed such a terrible man.
Oh, Eleanor,
said Marianne.
I'm sorry to make you so unhappy.
Just think how much you would have suffered if you discovered how terrible he was at the end of your engagement, replied Eleanor.
Engagement?
Cried Marianne.
We were never engaged. He never promised me anything.
He said he loved you, questioned Eleanor.
No, he never said so,
cried Marianne.
but I could feel it in his eyes.
She began sobbing again. Later, Mrs. Jennings showed concern for Marianne, who had made herself sick. She told them that Willoughby's other woman was Miss Grey, with an income of £50,000 per year, and that Willoughby spent too much money on his carriage and horses and needed money very badly. She thought his behavior was terrible, but cheerfully she said that it was all for the best, because now Marianne could marry Colonel Brandon.